Hey guys, I just wanted to share a resource that I use when I am defining a design problem to make it a little more interesting. So, the first thing you do kind of when you're looking at a design problem and trying to understand, like, okay, what is this thing? Where does it need to go? The usual place I find myself, and I design digital products and experiences, I find myself looking at, all right, well, let's do our research to understand the end user needs. And of course, let's do our homework to understand what's really going on with the business drivers and how those things come together. So that's the baseline of trying to understand any design problem and making sure you're trying to do the right research in both those areas to come up with a good understanding of the design problem and the problem space. And so if you were to do that alone, you would definitely sort of, get to probably where you need to be. But I personally find that it's actually not that interesting a way to frame a design problem. And when I look at the more creative outputs that I have been involved with, it's not so much a creative solution as it is better way of framing the problem. So, for example, if I talk about making an app that's some kind of utility app that helps people do something, like it helps them kind of get money from A to B, that sort of thing. That's great, but is it different when we talk about and saying, let's empower people, right? Like that's a different lens of looking through at a way of looking at things. And so I want to show you a resource I use called the Bain Pyramid of Values. So I first became aware of this resource a couple years ago. It came out in, I think, Harvard Business Review. And so it's just a really interesting way to frame design problems, so you maybe add some depth and complexity and ways of thinking about them. So let's go take a look at it. As you can see here, we've got that elements of value. So what's interesting about these is you can see we've got social impact, we've got life-changing, we've got emotional, and we've got functional. And you'll note there's kind of a circle moving around from value to value. This page is animated. I'm not actually doing that, but if you were to click one of these, I think it gives you a definition of what's going on here so you can dive a little deeper. But these are really interesting ways to add a dimension to when you are defining the problem, the design problem that you're solving for. So as I said earlier, if you are looking at the end user needs and you're looking at the business needs and how those things come together, you're going to generate something that a basic line functional problem that you can solve for. But what gets more interesting is when we start thinking about how to look at those design problems through these sorts of lenses. So if I was to take designing an app for a bank as an example, I could think about how the bank talks about it, which is like, hey, what we want? Make us an app that helps us, helps us save money by reducing the number of tellers we need to help people put money in the bank, and puts the power of mobile banking in people's pockets. So that's the kind of the business need. And if we look at the end user need, they're like, you know what? Make this easy for me. Don't make it hard for me to deposit money. Let's maybe help me take a photo of my checks or something like that, right? Stuff that already exists today. And that's good. You would get something that is functional out of that, and that's not bad. But what happens if we start thinking about maybe just beyond functional? And I should say, just because functional is on the bottom doesn't mean that it's somehow not as important as emotional. It's just a different way of evaluating the problem. But if we were to say, let's make people feel empowered when they use this banking app, that's a little bit different than just saying, let's make sure it's easy for them to put money in. We're talking now about this sort of human value that has, in this case, literally an emotional sort of impact. So could we start thinking about looking at these different types of elements and how they might exist inside the experience, whether it's reducing anxiety or whatever, such that it has makes people feel empowered and actually has an emotional impact. And then potentially you could start moving your way up the chain and say, can we make it life-changing? Are there ways we can start target these higher levels? So these are interesting lenses that we can use and change the dimensions of how we're thinking about the design problems. So I should point out, when we look at this one, this is like saying, hey, these are business to consumer elements, so B2C. So these are ways that companies can think about their end user. If I was, hired by a company to think about an end user, this would be the chart I was hitting to think about, where their product might need to be on this, or maybe more importantly, maybe today it's an existing product and their product is here, but maybe we need to bump it up. How do we get it up to here? So then we kind of have a way of framing that conversation, like, hey client, today it's here, you've come to us because you want something different. Let's talk about ways we can change it and make it more and maybe emotionally impactful, which thus would change your positioning in the market. That's one way to think about it. And then there's one other one we've got here. I want to say, oops, where'd it go? Social impact. So this is our other graphic. So I was talking about those B2C elements. So that's good if I'm hired to think about how to create consumer end products or experiences. But what if I'm hired to create something for another company? So B2B. So Bain also has this. This just came out, I think, I want to say maybe this year. I think it's definitely newer. And so this is really interesting because it's got a different set of values as applies from sort of one business to another. So this might be a good resource if you are in the position of thinking about generating a creative direction that needs to tackle this sort of thing. How do we like, where's the product today, and maybe where does it need to go? So it helps frame that design problem differently. So these are just one of the go-tos I use, and there's a lot of resources out there that kind of tackle this. These are just kind of two nice ones to be able to sort of frame your discussion.